Kia ora, I'm Sharon Brett-Kelly. Today on The Detail.
A body has been recovered in the search for a student missing in Abbey Caves near Whangarei.
His outdoor education group became trapped in the Abbey Caves. 14 others and 2 adults got out.
They were just saying that a group of friends were trapped in the cave. The water had come up really fast and that they needed help immediately.
There's an alert, weather alert, and here's a school taking these children into these caves while this is going on.
The death of a student at Abbey Caves in Whangarei brings back memories of one of New Zealand's worst outdoor recreation tragedies.
6 Elam Christian College students and their teacher died while canyoning at the Sir Edmund Hillary Outdoor Pursuit Centre in April 2008.
So, 15 years on, why are fatal mistakes still being made?
It felt like the whole ground shifted under our feet up to Mangatepopo, and we needed to have far stronger safety procedures in place.
We look at what happened at Mangatepopo in 2008, the toughest safety rules that came out of it, and why schools aren't subject to them.
The Ministry of Education says no qualification is needed to lead most outdoor activities, with the exception of rafting. It says incompetent leaders and ineffective supervision are major contributing factors when things go badly wrong.
Well, Neil Silverwood is a professional caver and guide, and he also does safety audits on outdoor recreation and adventure companies.
When I heard about the Mangatepopo tragedy, I was in the 3rd year of a degree in outdoor education. I previously worked as an outdoor instructor at the Outdoor Pursuit Centre, and then I'd returned to finish my degree. And when I say we, myself and the other tutors and the other students were just in a state of shock. We thought the outdoor sector had reached the point where accidents like that would no longer occur. And especially not for such a major outdoor centre as Sir Edmund Hillary Outdoor Pursuit Centre, now known as Hillary Outdoors. So absolutely shocked when we heard the news of the tragedy.
You actually had a connection with the centre. You had worked there.
Yeah, I'd worked at the centre for 1 year full time, and then on and off as a contractor. And I had studied at Taipatini Polytechnic in 1995 and been on the Cave Creek platform the day before it failed.
On the 28th of April 1995, a Department of Conservation viewing platform collapsed and fell 30 metres into a ravine near Punakaiki on the west coast, killing 13 students from Taipatini Polytechnic and 1 dock worker.
So I lost a lot of classmates through that accident, and so it really brought those memories back up again.
Mangatepopo, what actually happened there?
A group from Elam College were doing a 5-day course, a standard course, and on the day of the tragedy, there was rain in the forecast and easing off late afternoon. No heavy rain warnings per se. And 3 groups had decided they were going to do part of the canyoning trip. And this is a really dramatic canyon. It's 100 metres deep, 4 to 5 metres wide, small river flowing through it. And rather than going downstream to decrease the risk, they decided to go up the canyon, just do a shorter version and then turn around. So 2 of the groups walked into the canyon and then changed their mind just because the rain at that point had become so intense. They decided it wasn't safe, and a new young instructor decided to give it a crack. And my understanding is as she entered the canyon, the water had risen a little bit and turned around and started coming back down the canyon. And at that point, it's starting to flood quite quickly. And perhaps my thoughts are if she continued at that point, when it wasn't still too high, she would have got out, but made the decision to stop on a ledge, put all the students in a safe spot and try and get them warm. The water continued to rise until it was basically up to the students' feet. Or even higher, and then made the decision to swim them out. So clip the strong students to the weak students. They actually tie them together so the strong student could help the weak student. She swam down first with a throw bag, and then the students came down one by one or 2 by 2 per se. And where she was located was just upstream of a dam. I can't remember its height, maybe 8 metres. and she was successful in throw-bagging some of the students, but the majority went over that dam and then mostly drowned as a result. So there were seven deaths.
The father of one of the students killed in the Mangatepopo canyoning tragedy says he's shocked by the litany of errors and incompetence which have been revealed at the inquest into the deaths.
So inexperience was a big factor, guide inexperience.
Yep, workplace culture as well. So OPC had a really high staff turnover. Like, generally speaking, it takes a year or so at least to really find your feet as an outdoor instructor. And at that point, people were staying at OPC for 6 months, max of a year. They just weren't getting the skills up that they needed. So there's a really high staff turnover, inexperience, and perhaps a little bit of hubris.
Evidence was presented that the children should never have been in the gorge that day, and those who could have stopped them didn't. The centre was said to be plagued by poor communication and a lack of support for junior staff.
OPC, and having worked there at that time, was working on a model that relied on experience. So one of the other instructors that turned around that day was highly experienced, and they didn't really have strong systems in place per se and experienced instructors. They would rely on the judgment of the individual instructor, and now they've gone towards a model which relies greatly on rigid standards. So they have a traffic light system in place the last time I worked there, which is green, orange and red, depending on the different weather forecasts in the day, and so far stronger safety standards in place than they would have had.
Because weather was a huge thing. The weather, it was atrocious.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, absolutely. I think I do remember OPC at the time after the tragedy highlighting the fact that in their view this was sort of a freak occurrence or a freak flood, and I didn't feel that was the case. Like the Mangatepopo flooded reasonably regularly, and this was just one of those flows. There just happened to be a group in there on that day, but I don't think it was a freak accident per se.
And what changed after that, Neil? I mean, so you're saying that you were studying at the time, you were doing a degree, and you went on to become a guide. You're now a real specialist in the outdoors, and you're a caver yourself. After that accident, did things change in terms of the rules and even what you were being taught?
I think the industry changed greatly, as you'd expect, because that's the worst tragedy in the history of outdoor recreation in New Zealand. All of the previous tragedies, Cave Creek aside, that I can think of, there's only ever been one single death. And the industry has regulated greatly, so all companies now need to have a safety audit. Some of the operators out there, certainly at that time, were cowboys, and I think that's mostly gone from the industry. And I get the strong impression, there's far less incidents and accidents in the outdoors because of it. We've come a long way.
These are the safety operating procedures?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, safety operating procedures are much stronger, and we have auditing processes in place where all outdoor companies operating in moderate to high risk environments will need to have a safety audit. So a safety auditor will come through and look at how the company is operating, looking if they're meeting their safety operating requirements. They have the ability to shut that whole program down if need be, which is also is really expensive. So some of the smaller players perhaps have had to leave the industry, but it has made it far safer.
We were going to explore this with Jono Maxwell, the manager for Hillary Outdoors in Tongariro, previously the Outdoor Pursuit Centre, but he was told by the board not to speak to us. In the years since the Mangatepopo tragedy, commercial operators have had to work under much stricter safety rules, the Adventure Activities Regulations. For schools, it's different. There was a review into school guidelines on outdoor education after Mangatepopo, but the onus is still on schools and their boards to be responsible for student safety. Like all schools, Whangarei Boys High School has an outdoor health and safety policy, and you can read it on its website.
WorkSafe helped develop the National Caving Safety Guidelines, which state instructors should know how and when to cancel a trip. This includes knowing weather forecasts, the maximum safe water level and waiting areas, escape routes, and how to get out if the water rises.
And it is expected this will all be part of WorkSafe's investigation.
A former WorkSafe investigator has told RNZ the current inquiry will be looking at the Whangarei School's decision to go into the caves despite the bad weather, who made the call and what reassurances they had that the students would be safe. They'll be scrutinising everything that led up to that decision and will likely take a guide into the caves to look at the risks.
So what is it like to be a guide for a group of young people? Here's Neil again.
When you're working as an outdoor instructor, you have loco apprentice, so those students are solely your responsibility. And I think the parents' perception is their child will be put in an environment where there's probably going to be a high perceived risk, but a low actual risk. And so a high perceived risk would be, say, if you're out rock climbing, you're attached to a rope, carabiners and harness, all the equipment has been checked. When you climb up there, it's absolutely terrifying, but the actual real risk is quite low. I think when we have loco apprentice, we have a huge responsibility, and we have to ensure that we are keeping those children safe and giving them an experience where there's a moderate to high perceived risk, but an actual low risk in reality.
Do you feel that these sorts of activities are taken seriously enough in New Zealand, say, compared with other countries?
That's a real hard. I think New Zealand's unique in that we have ACC and we don't have a culture where you can sue. So that's allowed the commercial adventure tourism industry and outdoor recreation to thrive. It hasn't been able to do so in many other countries in the world due to the risk of suing, really. And I think, so we are able to offer far more adventurous experiences than others are.
And of course, we don't want to stop these kinds of activities because they're amazing and they're part of growing up in New Zealand, aren't they? But I do wonder what happens. I mean, does the industry lose a bit of confidence when there is a big tragedy?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. It felt like the whole ground shifted under our feet up to Mangatepopo, and we needed to have far stronger safety procedures in place. But I think now, if we're still seeing accidents, we may need stronger regulation in place. We need to ensure this doesn't happen. We need to ensure that the perceived risk is moderate to high and the actual risk is really low. As an example, so cave systems act as natural drains. So if it rains on the surface, all of that water flows through a really confined gap. They can flood really quickly, and we should make sure we have, at the very minimum, a flow gauge at the bottom of the cave entrance or the outlet, and we have a system where we don't enter those places if it's raining per se. So we may need stronger regulation.
Just to be clear, what you are saying is, if it's raining, the cave should be closed, just out of bounds, full stop.
No, not necessarily. So many caves will flood, not all caves, and you might have safe areas inside those caves. So you need really good safe operating procedures in place to know if there is a flood, what you can or can't do. You certainly should have a flow gauge at the entrance with a maximum flow that you would enter that cave in. And if it's likely to rise while the party is in that cave, they should not be entering. So really good systems in place to try and protect the students. You've got to realise too, like there's potential for. There's very few places in the outdoors where a whole group can be killed. If you're climbing a mountain, there might be a rockfall and one student could be hurt, injured, or even potentially killed. But caves or canyons are one of the only places where an entire group can be wiped out through flooding or flash flooding. So we have to take an extremely cautious approach.
So would caves be the most dangerous places that you could take a group of young people?
I think caving, generally speaking, is not dangerous. So in normal weather conditions where there's very little chance of flooding, or in a cave system which has old fossil dry passages we can get above the cave streamway, it can be an experience which has a moderate to high sort of perceived risk, but actually low level of risk. It's when we enter caves where it's raining, where that risk really increases. We just have to be extremely cautious on those days.
Can you explain to me a flow gauge? What does it look like?
Yeah, a flow gauge is bolted onto the wall. at the entrance or exit of a cave, or the upstream entrance where the water flows in or where the water flows out. And as the water rises, it simply climbs up the numbers. So most operators, tourism operators operating cave trips, will have a flow gauge, at least one flow gauge, maybe several. And when it reaches a certain point, they'll likely stop operating or potentially change their ratios. So they might go from a ratio of 1 to 10 clients to 1 to 5 clients in high water, or alter the trip to a shorter trip if there's multiple entrances.
So the guide would have that flow gauge on them?
No, the flow gauge is bolted onto the cave wall, so it's there permanently. So many caves, such as Waitomo, would have 2 or 3 of these flow gauges bolted on. They're just a kind of like a road marker, if you like, with numbers written on the side, and as the water goes up, you can measure it against that number to understand what conditions are going to be like.
And have you ever been in a situation where you're guiding a group, Neil, and you've had to make a difficult decision to either carry on or to turn back?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's been many incidents and accidents regarding caves flooding in New Zealand, so groups getting trapped, and there has actually been one previous death on a school camp where a student was washed away down a streamway in Castle Hill in the central South Island.
Neil's talking there about 17-year-old Vina Duke, who was swept away in Canterbury's cave stream in 1987.
I've been in caves multiple times when they've flooded, but always been able to climb out into a safe area. And so if I'm operating there in those sort of conditions, I've always been thinking about the fact that it might flood, and I might need to take my clients into a safe zone. But one incident that really stands out for me is I was going up a cave streamway, and the water was slowly rising. It couldn't potentially hit the roof at that point, and we got to a point where it could potentially rise to the roof. There would be no safe area to go to, so we stopped, waited 10 minutes to see what was going to happen. Next time we looked, it had indeed hit the roof, and so you wouldn't have survived if you'd gone any further. And it was just experience that day that stopped me making a bad decision. We turned around and went back out a safe route.
And it's the guide who makes that call, obviously.
It's the guide that makes that call, but in a company with new or young guides, most of the responsibility lies with the company per se. And a company that employs qualified guides that have been operating for many years, or outdoor instructors that have been operating for many years, the responsibility sits far more with the staff members. They can make a lot more calls on their own. So in New Zealand, we have something called New Zealand Outdoor Instructors Association, NZOIA. And so we have an entry-level qualification, a level 1 and a level 2. And by the time you reach level 2, you should be able to operate with far less guidance from above, per se.
But do you think we will ever get to the point in New Zealand where we can go on these adventure activities and no one dies?
There will always be inherent risk in adventure activities, but we can get it to the point where accidents are extremely rare events. And I hope that's where we're heading. So there's always a degree of inherent risk, but most of the accidents we've seen in the past in the outdoors and on professional commercial trips have been really needless. They haven't been from inherent risks. They've been from making significant mistakes where they just shouldn't have happened. So
human error, but what would it take? Is it tougher rules, and is it tougher penalties? I think it's, tougher penalties. I think perhaps the answer lies in stronger regulation, so more comprehensive auditing. What is the penalty now if there is a big accident? It's a good question, but in most cases, they won't work in the industry again, and it's going to potentially destroy their lives. Having to think about that every day. It scared me a lot, and I worked as outdoor instructor. So, do you work now as a guide? I do casually. I mostly work as a photographer. Funnily enough, working tomorrow for the next 2 days in the outdoors, but occasionally outdoor instructing at a tertiary level. But does it put you off, a terrible accident like we've had this week? I think it would put anyone off, and I think it makes it less appealing to want to work in that industry. It's the last thing you want to have happen working as a guide or instructor. Our job is to keep people safe, and
It's just the worst case scenario when something like that happens.
That's it for today. I'm Sharon Brett-Kelly. The Detail is supported by the Public Interest Journalism Fund. This episode was engineered by William Saunders and produced by Sarah Robson and Bonnie Harrison. And thanks to Neil Silverwood. Ka kite anō.